be about 3 years or so after I became Muslim, when I went to university. I picked up a few things here and there. Even wrote a really short article about Quilliam in the 90s. It was published in a local magazine from Tooting in South London, published by Malana Amin Khalwadia, who's now in America. But he ran a little magazine, and he asked me to write about Quilliam. So I wrote a little piece, but really I knew next to nothing at the time. And he wasn't really well known at the time in the British Muslim communities. We'd forgotten about him basically. And just rediscovering him in a big way was still some decades away for me and for many other people.
Okay, fascinating. It's very interesting. And why is it that you think you ended up in this research? What is it about this that interested you particularly about the history of Islam in the UK?
I think that to speak to some of the themes that you wanted me to touch on tonight, as a convert, I've always been interested in trying to discover what a deeply felt British Islam, or English Islam, for want of a better word, but something that's culturally British or culturally English, how you can marry that with the Islamic faith. And that's been that's always been a question for me. And one of the ways I look for a point of reference or a point of inspiration or a point of contrast even was to go back into the past and see how other converts to Islam tried to marry their culture and their faith together in Britain. And we're quite lucky to have quite a long history going back, 130, 140 years with many different figures. And although, the Victorian period is familiar to us in many ways, it's also quite different in other ways. So it's quite instructive to kind of compare and contrast with our times now. To give you one example, it was a much, much more religious society than our society is now. It was, when Britain was industrializing and millions of people were moving from the countryside to the cities, there was a huge revival in Christianity at that point. Thousands and thousands of new churches were built across the country and in the new cities. And so there was a kind of faith revival that went on. And there's always been a historic link in Britain between the nonconformist churches. Nonconformism were those Protestant churches that would break away from the official church, Anglicanism. Okay, so they were kind of breakaway Protestant sects, like the Wesleyans or the Quakers, the Methodists, and so on. So historically, and also the Unitarians, and historically, all these churches, breakaway churches, often many people, significant numbers of people came to Islam through these churches as a kind of a step. And Quilliam himself, of course, Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, who founded the Liverpool Muslim community, was himself from a Wesleyan background. His father was a Wesleyan lay preacher. But Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad in Cambridge, who's arguably our leading convert scholar in Britain today, has written a little book about converts, and he himself makes the same point about how many of the converts to Islam in Britain had links to nonconformism, and particularly to kind of ideas around Unitarianism. So Unitarianism, the idea that that you don't Christians who don't believe in the divinity of Jesus, but who believe in the one absolute oneness of God. And there's always been a link, historic link, going back four centuries or so in British history, back where there's always been a fascination with Islam and with the figure of the Prophet for all these centuries. But conversion became a more common feature in the late 19th century, really. Once Britain's empire had expanded in Britain, there were something like 100 million Muslims living in the British Empire at that point. So many British people had the chance to go out and discover Islam directly as part of the colonial enterprise, and many converted while they were out in out in the colonies, as it were. So it was a point of great contact. I mean, amidst all the racism and the exploitation and so on, there were always people who were seeking alternatives. And so it's for me, the converts movement in late 19th century Britain is a kind of counter movement, a kind of point of hope that people could remain open to each other, open to exploring radical alternatives. And I think that's an important message to have now, when it seems to me we live in a kind of age of division and misunderstanding. It seems very important to me that we look to history to inspire us, for people who broke down barriers, broke down boundaries, and were willing to look at alternatives, no matter how unfashionable they might be.
Okay, it's interesting that was new to me. I'll be honest, but it's you can see how when there's this culture of non-conformism, that Islam, and please correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't as radical a difference as perhaps it is today, or how was it received by the people of the time? What was the image of Islam at the time? Was it still something very very distinct, almost foreign, perhaps even exotic, or what did your research find?
Well, I mean, I'm not researching all of this from scratch. I mean, obviously, I'm reliant on reading books produced by other scholars, like all of us. Although I do some of my own primary research as well. So I'm not giving you my own discoveries here, but I'm summarizing what others have researched. But to keep it straightforward, I mean, if you imagine that there's a class of seekers, individuals looking for spiritual truths, and they would tend to look at things philosophically, spiritually, or religiously, okay, because it was a much more Christian society, people tended to come from a Christian background. They tended to have had some kind of formal Christian education as children. But these were changing times: urbanization, industrialization, the rise of science. Okay, there was an atheist movement that emerges in the 19th century. There's a lot of religious fluidity. Okay, people beginning with empire and travel and everything and trade, people beginning to look outside of Christianity for other sorts of answers. And part of that was to look at alternatives to Christianity. Alternatives to Christianity for this first time. And that included Islam. Islam was part of that search. It certainly wasn't the only non-Christian religion that the British were looking at, those seekers amongst the British were looking at, but it certainly was one of them. And the early convert community was obviously an important manifestation of that search. At the same time, it was the height of the imperial age. So, you had, this is the century that brought us imperialism and brought us the concept of scientific racism, and the idea, that the British were there to civilize the world, so all those ideas existed. And, in many ways, people who were open to what the colonized peoples had to offer at the time, you really were swimming against the tide. That one has to say that this wasn't a mass movement. This was swimming against the tide of, colonialism and racism, the kind of the great kind of intolerant attitudes of the day. So I think, we have to recognize that.
And would you say that conversion in this time represents a form of non-conformism and also swimming against the tide, albeit a different kind of tide?
Well, this is something that many converts to Islam in my generation and the generations that came out, before me, because I think there was another revival in conversion to Islam in Britain, not just in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but the other revival point was the 1960s, when a lot of converts came to Islam, through the counterculture, through the emergence of the New Age movements, and were looking for alternative spiritual paths. And some of them ended up in Sufism. And so there was an important, convert movement again in the 60s and 70s. Another important stream alongside that was the Black Civil Rights Movement, Black Power, Malcolm X, and the inspiration he gave to generations in Britain after them, particularly amongst the Black British community. as well. So Malcolm X being a trailblazer in those same decades.
Mm-hmm.
So you had sort of the hippie trail on one side, and you had the sort of Black Power on the other side, influenced by Islam.
Mm-hmm.
But in the present day, I'd say really from the time of not just 9/11, but before 9/11, with the Iranian Revolution of 1979, really this is when, you know, all of a sudden Islam was sort of seen almost sort of as a having been seen as sort of, you know, kind of colonized, quiet, defeated, if you like. The Iranian Revolution really signaled a revival of Islam in the world. Okay, and in the West, it was suddenly seen as a kind of new enemy. And so, you know, prior to that, really in the 60s and 70s, you know, there wasn't really any real, Islam wasn't on anybody's agenda,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But at the same time, British Islam wasn't on anybody's agenda until the Rushdie affair of 1989. So that was when there was a protest over a book that many Muslims felt personally insulted by, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that attacked the person of the Prophet. And that led to large demonstrations, and that led to kind of political visibility of Muslim communities in Britain who'd come to settle in large numbers after the Second World War. Okay, currently we have over 3 million Muslims. At the time, maybe the Rushdie affair, maybe it was about 1 million. And so there was this increasing visibility of Muslims, and it seemed like, you know, one way you could look at it is that, you know, that if you just read the newspapers, you could just see it as a series of crises and a series of clashes.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And again, after 9/11, or if there's been a terrorist attack or whatever, you know, Islam is in the news, and normally it's in the bad news column. You know, it's about bad things happening. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I think to kind of ignore all of that buzz and noise and headlines, and to actually look behind the headlines, is to swim against the tide. I mean, I agree with you. And I like to think that, you know, we've all been brought up, you know, to have common sense, to weigh things up, to be fair, to be balanced, you know, to not just go for the easy headline, the easy stereotype, but to look beyond the headlines, and talk to people, meet people. And at least, you know, at least if one is looking into Islam, at least to get to know, make some Muslim friends, just get to know them as neighbors, you know, and I think that's knowing somebody personally and knowing about them as and having a friend can make all the difference to, you know, putting the screaming headlines into their proper place, which is really, you know, talking either stereotype and made up, or it's talking about a margin of a margin of a margin. 0.00001% or whatever. And so, you know, it's so important, you know, that even just people can live together peacefully and respectfully, and with mutual understanding. That's at least is a common point, you know. I mean, one of the things about the Prophet, peace be upon him, was that he was known in his society, and he was trusted. He was called Al-Amin. That meant he was held as a trustee for people's valuables. So people would leave their valuables with him because they trusted him. And even, you know, before he became a prophet at the age of 40 or after, he carried this function of looking after people's valuables. These are even people who actually opposed his mission and opposed him personally and made life very difficult for him. They still knew he was a trustworthy person. So I think what's really, really important is that even before we start talking about our faith, to people, I think it's really important that we're in a position of trust with them, just like the Prophet Salatu Wasalam was. We must have trust with people and mutual respect, so that they're receptive to what we have, to our way of life.
Absolutely, and I guess one of the ways that this trustworthiness comes is by being authentic and being almost reconciled as an individual, in terms of one's identity and this newfound faith. I mean, and we titled today's talk, "Can I be British and Muslim?" And it's intentionally provocative. Is this a question that was asked by the earliest convert communities in the UK? Is this something that we can learn from how they married the two and apply it to our situation today?
I mean, the thing that's striking about the early convert community, is that they didn't even ask themselves this question. I mean, it was more like, of course, we're British Muslims. You know, I mean, it was a different time then. There were maybe at most 10,000 Muslims in the country at the time. There was no organized community. The only mosque in the 1880s, 1890s, you know, functioning mosque that functioned as a mosque, not a building that looks like a mosque in Woking, but a sort of functioning mosque community, was in Liverpool. So there was only one mosque really until about 1895 when there was a temporary mosque set up in London. But there wasn't you know, so the converts were sort of on their own in terms of community organization. So, you know, they basically, it was a very, although they had some Islamic knowledge, it's obvious at the beginning in the first several years, practice was quite syncretic. It was quite mixed with nonconformism, the nonconformism that many of them had come out of. So, you know, when Muslims came to the mosque, you know, they would sometimes question the way in which they conducted their worship and things like that, and created some kind of controversies and so on. But it was a result of them actually just trying to practice Islam with what they knew and what was in their hand. You know, they didn't have, like today, we've got the internet and we've got 1,000 books on Islam you can look at and 1,000 scholars you can email or bother on WhatsApp. They didn't have those sorts of resources back then. And they were making their way as they went along with very, very few resources. But they had no question that they were British or that they were on the right, you know, they weren't separate from the rest of society. They were all still involved in social activism. Quilliam was a very prominent trade unionist, for instance. He defended the rights of the sailors in the docks, you know, the sailors who would be left homeless on the docks or wouldn't be paid by the shipping companies, either the Muslim sailors who'd come from Bengal or Egypt or the Yemen and just dumped in Liverpool's docks.
Wow.
You know, so they were looking after these people. So they didn't make any distinction between their faith and their cultural identities or their social role in society. So I think, you know, this is the same, that you assume one has to assume it's a daft question in the first place. Can I be British and Muslim? Even though many people are raising that question for hostile reasons, actually it's a daft question. You know, it really is. You know, of course you can be British and Muslim. You know, exactly what that looks like for you as an individual is, you know, like an open question. But is it possible? Of course it's possible, you know.
So why do you think then that this question, it exists today? Do you think it's as a result, is this question coming from without, or is this coming from within the Muslim community, the convert community themselves, or is it due to the other attention or the external factors that are asking the question in the first place that perhaps the converts themselves wouldn't have ordinarily asked?
Yeah, I think that I should preface, before answering your question, I should say that, you know, we should take the view that Islam is a universal faith. The Prophet, salatu wassalam, peace be upon him, he was sent to all of humanity as a mercy to the world. So he wasn't just sent to the Arabs. You know, 80% of the Muslims in the world today are non-Arab. It's basically a non-Arab religion. Okay, so he was sent to all communities, to all peoples. Okay, so if you can be a Muslim and a good Pakistani, or a Muslim and a good Malaysian, or a Muslim and a good Senegalese, or a Muslim and a good American, why can't you be a good Muslim and British? You know, if Islam is a universal religion, then it can be manifested in all cultures. You know, and we do not live in a Muslim community that's monolithic. We have all sorts of lovely flavors and masala mixes and colors and shapes and sizes, you know, and that's part of the, you know, as Allah says in the Quran, you know, that he's made us into different nations or groups of people so that we can know one another. So the fact we have their cultural difference is part of his design, part of his creative power, and that we thank Allah for making us different. You know, to be different is part of his gift, if that makes sense. Yeah, so the fact we have different languages, different cultures is part of God's gift to us. You know, different appearances, different skin colors is part of Allah's gift. It's part of his creativity. He's not made us all look the same or be the same. So it's something to be thankful for. Now we've turned this into something where something of discord in the world. We've organized our politics around difference and made it problematic. But this is not what God is calling to us in the world. He says merely just a simple recognition and appreciation of difference, but not to stigmatize, not to think I'm superior and the other is inferior, and so on and so forth. So, that's my caveat. Now, to get to your question, okay, to get to your question, I think that there are three. That there's an internal and an external discomfort with the idea of British Islam or Muslims being British. So in the outside, there is a kind of an Islamophobic attitude that, Islam is a foreign religion, has nothing to do with Britain, and therefore how can there possibly be a British Islam? Okay, so that boiling it down into a simple language, there's that attitude. Okay, but within the Muslim community, there's also an anxiety about converts trying to marry their culture with their faith, their newfound faith tradition of Islam. And the reason for that is because they're often worried about their children becoming assimilated into British culture. So British culture is seen as an antagonistic force that's going to secularize your children. So this was definitely the attitude of the kind of generation that migrated to Britain. It's totally different for British-born Muslims, okay, born into and brought up in the faith, or whether they've converted, because British culture is part of what they grew up with. So for them, that's not a question, but it was a question, and there's a bit of a hangover of that still. There's still a bit of a hangover that sort of sees the idea as a kind of forced marriage between British cultures and Islamic faith isn't going to work. Whereas actually, the generations that have grown up here actually naturally already don't see it as a problem. So I think this internal thing is already sort of beginning to fade. I'm speaking from the experience of 30 years. 30 years ago, it was different. There was much more suspicion, and it's really changed so much over 30 years, which is a long time. Whole new generations have come through, and they just that so many things have changed. I think the final thing, which I think was a problem of the earlier decades, was that there were a few attempts to have isolated attempts to have a kind of separate convert communities, and sometimes that sort of backfired because it created some kind of tension or suspicion between the different Muslim communities. And I think now there's an appreciation that, we're all a community within communities, communities within one faith community. So, there should always be some room and space for people to express their cultural identity. And at other times we all come together and do a Mawlid in praise of the Prophet. We come together for a common political cause, or we come together to fast during Ramadan or celebrate Eid together collectively. All our communities come together. But there are also times and places where, you just want to sort of let your hair down in a cultural space that's familiar to you. So I don't think we need to problematize it too much. I just think that there should be recognized that there is a developing convert community now. It's not just about, the first 2 years or so when you're trying to find your feet after embracing the faith. There should be more of an awareness that we actually, more than 100,000 strong converts plus in this country. That it's a sizable enough number that we should start to think of ourselves as a community, which means you have to be there for each other all the time, not just in the first 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, and do you think that there, obviously, I'm sure you've seen lots of changes, as you've mentioned, in the 30 years. But I guess one theme that seems to be recurring, and my experience isn't as long as 30 years, admittedly, but this idea of culture and the importance of culture and Islam's view on culture, because it would seem that certain manifestations of Islam, when people convert, Islam it is almost seen as something predatory, and that's something that's almost embraced sometimes by the convert, who thinks that they have to commit, in the words of someone else, commit cultural apostasy and kind of abandon everything that makes them who they are, essentially, and replace that with Islam. And is that a tendency you still see occurring today, or do you think that's something that's also kind of waned over those 30 years that you've been apart and observing the convert community in the UK?
Yeah, by and large, yeah. I mean, I even remember, I went through this phase myself, the first few years of sort of, trying to be, follow somebody else's culture, because I thought that Islam was bound up in another culture, and that I was being told that, British culture was the opposite of Islam. And it was something that I had to abandon for the Sunnah, not understanding at the time the difference between the Sunnah as a universal principle of practice and cultural variation within that. Because for me, it was offered to me as a gift of love. People were trying to offer me the best of what they had. They offered me the Islam of their childhood, and maybe that they were taught that in some other country, and they were offering that to me as a complete package. Do you see what I mean? They weren't making a distinction between the cultural and the religious dimensions of that package. Okay. They weren't doing the work for me. And the truth is, we all have to do our own work. We converts have to do the work, and British born Muslims have to do the work to figure out what Islam as a British cultural expression looks like. And that's a work in progress, and that's a generational work that goes on. So I think that, yes, I went through that, and I saw many of my other peers in my generation of converts go through the same thing. But I've seen those same individuals who are now my age, 40s, 50s, come out of it and relax into a kind of cultural Anglo-Islamic synthesis of some kind, to have the confidence to do that. And I hope that, the converts who come after us aren't going to have to go through that long struggle to find that. But maybe we can have something to pass on to them that is a little bit more thought through, but, who knows? The only lesson from history that people ever learn is that they don't learn lessons from history. So, maybe I'm being overly optimistic here.
Inshallah, no. I like the idea of optimism, and I like the idea of it not having to take 30 years or decades in order to kind of expedite that journey. But and this might be a difficult question, but was there a turning point in your journey where you realized that actually it's okay that I am British, and it's okay to be who I am, and it's okay not to have to adopt a culture that's not foreign to me while still fully embracing the religion?
Weirdly, it's only been relatively recently. I should say that I married into a wonderful family of British Gujaratis, British Indian Muslims, and I've really enjoyed. I've been married for over 20 years. I really enjoy that, and I enjoy the fact that my kids come from a family where their grandparents were born or brought up on 4 different continents. So the way we bring our kids up is to be outward looking, to be cosmopolitan, to appreciate the rich cultural diversity they've got, whether that's America, whether that's Britain, whether that's East Africa, or whether that is India, Western India. They can, all those are different strands from their four grandparents. They can benefit from all of those, so we want them to be culturally open. And that's the way I try to look at my British identity. So I see, one way that Shakespeare writes about British identity is that he talks about it as an island surrounded by a moat. Okay. So the sea around Britain is a kind of a moat. It's like a defensive body of water that is protecting Britain from foreign influence. Okay. So that's one way of looking at Britain, is as a kind of island history, an island protected by the sea. Okay, but there's another way to look at the sea, not as a moat, but as a means of connection. Okay, so in other words, the whole of Britain's history is also about people coming and going, moving to Britain, moving out of Britain, trade, war, expansion, but also contact, and exchange and so on. So the sea as a means to travel, not the sea as a protector, as a moat. Okay, so this is the way that I see my British identity, is not the kind of identity that puts up a moat around Britain, but one that actually sets foot in a ship and sails out and explores the world and is open to the world. And that Britain was always open to the world. I know that there was colonial exploitation, but also at the same time there was openness. So I take the openness bit as part of my British identity, because it's that openness that allowed me to be open to Islam, and to be open to, travel and experiencing alternatives.
Mashallah, it's a really positive way of looking at it, and it's really quite powerful. And I hope it happens. I hope it helps. It's a benefit to some of our listeners here. By the way, if anyone has questions or comments, feel free to either raise your hand and you can unmute yourself, or you can ask a question in the room if you like, and I'll try and I've got the comments open up in front of me, so I can try and hopefully address those or pass them over to Yahya to address. But on this idea of a British Islam, how much do you think it will develop organically, and how much thought or specific thought in order to develop one is needed? What's the kind of balance?
I tend to think that it's always sort of grassroots. It happens organically and over generations, and it's the action of the mass of people. Historians, academics, scholars, theologians, they might ponder and muse and sort of write nice books and things like that, and people might even enjoy reading those books. They might even use some of the words in those books, but I tend to think it comes after the fact of this organic change from the ground, or tends to. I not think that people who kind of intellectualize these things lead the change. I think it's people on the ground who lead the change.
And how long do you think that process will take? I mean, obviously, it's
I don't think we have a crystal ball for the future. Only God knows the future. All I would say is that when we start, I was just talking to Sister Amina the other day in another podcast, and we were sort of saying that when we converted to Islam, we didn't even know what the map looked like and what a compass looked like. Whereas now we feel sort of we kind of got a rough idea where we're going, and we're sketching out the terrain, and we do have a compass in our hands. So I think it's just a question of, just build. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, so we just have to build on what came before, and inshallah we'll get there. Just have a good intention, trust in God, and make an effort.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt because my hand's been raised for the past 15 minutes. Imran noticed it. I wanted to ask about the Quilliam era. One thing I always ask, our historian, I've asked Dr. Mohammed Seddon as well, that Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, Sheikh al-Islam, he's got this fantastic mosque, fantastic community, doing all of this work, but we don't see any traces of that. We know what happened to the mosque after that. It seems like it just fizzled out, and I always see a sign of a successful model of Islam. Maybe it's the wrong way of looking at it, that community spreads like it did with the Prophet and his companions, and afterwards that Islam spreads and the followers increase. But for some reason, that community just disappeared. So I'm always curious as to, what were the reasons for that happening?
I think that's
I look at that and I think, could the same thing actually happen?
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, I mean, I think that we don't entirely know the answer to your question. Some research is happening now, and the way we do that is that we look at the hundreds of people who are mentioned in the Crescent as having converted to Islam, and then we trace each one through local history records, through census, court records, whatever, you name it. Like doing 100, 200 family histories instead of just doing, when people retire, they go and try and find out what their grandparents did or whatever, and they do a bit of family history when they retire. So you have to do that for 200, 300 people. So you can imagine that that work has started, and we've got some individual stories. In fact, I'm working on a book with which is coming out in hopefully in the spring next year, inshallah, which is the first. It's written in Ottoman Turkish, and it's an account of the Liverpool Muslim community from 1895, written by an Ottoman intellectual. So as part of the research for that book, we've been profiling some of the early converts in more detail for the first time. So, you find things like many of the converts were quite old, so they passed away quite, some of the early converts were quite aged. So some of them passed away during the time of the community. That's one reason. And some of the converts moved away and settled in some traveled abroad. Some went to, some of the work became attached to the Woking community. So when the Woking community emerged in 1912, some of the key senior figures were from the Liverpool community. So that there is a link between those two communities. So I think what I can say, Sheikh Bell, is it was sort of slowly piecing the story together, but I don't have a definitive answer for you. There isn't like one answer at the moment I can give you. And I'm sorry, it's going to be a question of watch this space, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Jazakallah khairan.
Yeah. It half answers it saying, wait, watch this space, right?
Yeah. I assumed that, it would be, fairly complex, and like you said, it will need a lot more research.
Yeah.
But
I don't want to speculate. I want to try and get
absolutely.
try and figure out what the evidence tells us, So.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, Yahya, you mentioned that you're working on another book. What's your second book about?
Well, the first book is this Ottoman travelogue of the account of the Liverpool community from 1895. So that's called Islam and Victorian Liverpool, an Ottoman account of Liverpool's first Muslim community. The second book I'm editing with Ron Gies, which is a collection of Sheikh Abdullah's poetry that he wrote from 1892 all the way up to 1931, the year before he died. So it's the first complete collection of his poetry to have been ever published. So that's called My Inmost Heart, the collected poetry of Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam. And there's some gems in there, I think it probably his poetry is in many ways his greatest legacy. And so I'm really pleased to have been able to put this all together for the first time.
Wow, that's incredible. That's really incredible. Yeah. Can you give us a sneak preview? What kind of themes do you see emerging in, or what kind of
in the poetry?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I wish I could recite the poetry off by heart, but I haven't got a screen open so I can read some. But if I describe it, it was there was obviously sort of devotional poetry, and he wrote his early poetry is very much written as an imam of a community, so it's very much, in a way, servicing the religious needs of that community, educating that community. Some of the poems are teaching poems. Yeah, some of the poems are, they're meant to teach, literally teaching poems.
Wow.
Then on the side, he loved history and he loved nature. So quite often, some of his poems are just poems about the natural world, about historical events. Sometimes he wrote poems about particular occasions. Even he wrote poems about the coronation. Often he adapted Christian hymns and changed the words to reflect a more Islamic ethos. The most radical one he ever wrote was changing the words of the national anthem to God, God bless the Muslim cause, etc., etc.
Wow.
Yeah. Later in life, when he became a more accomplished scholar, he which was translating or adapting poetry from Arabic and Farsi sources into translation, into his own poetic creations. That's been some of the poetry that I've been uncovering for this volume. The most interesting thing is that he wrote a book of devotional poetry and published it in 1916. And because he did it under a pseudonym, nobody thought it was by him, because it was attributed to a Turkish Sufi poet from the 16th century, but actually it was Quilliam himself. So it took a bit of detective work for us to prove that. But I think with the help of Turkish scholars, I think we're fairly satisfied that it was Quilliam himself. But there's some incredible poems in that collection, which we're putting together, bringing out again with his other poetry for the first time. So yeah, so that will be exciting. That will add to our literary culture.
That really is, yeah. I mean, I wasn't aware of that. Yes, I'm very excited for that personally.
Yeah.
Todd had a question. Todd, do you wanna go ahead?
Sure, thanks, Iman, and yeah, thanks very much for everything that I've heard so far. I've found it extremely informative. I too, like, I've been exploring Islam in the last 2 or 3 months, and you know, you spoke about that openness, and I liked what you were saying about the rise of the converts around the time of Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. And I wondered if you saw any similars in today, you know, what we're seeing with BLM. And for myself, I'm a climate activist. I'm in Extinction Rebellion. I'm linked to Extinction Rebellion Muslim group. And, you know, for me, like, I see also as a vegan, like I'm seeing a lot of these links between, you know, how Islam talks about the need to protect the earth, and, you know, that connection with the earth and respecting animals as well. So yeah, I just wondered, like, obviously you spoke about that grassroots movement, if you felt that, you know, there was any links between what we're seeing now and you know, how we could, you know, gain numbers as converts and make these links. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I've been talking a lot about 120 years ago, but I totally agree with you that, you know, Islam can speak to every generation a different way. And obviously the climate crisis is, you know, at the forefront of everybody's minds. It's a thing that won't go away, that we have to deal with. And so, you know, it will only be right for Muslims who have this incredible tradition, incredible teaching about living in balance with nature and not walking heavily upon the earth, and recognizing in the Quran recognizes other animals as having communities like human communities. And so, you know, and there's a deep spiritual connection between many of the prophets and the animal kingdom, which is, you know, noted again and again in the Quran. So this is definitely, I agree with you that this is one way. You know, we believe as Muslims there are 2 kinds of signs in the world. There's the sign, or ayah. It means it's a verse of the Quran, but also a sign in us and in nature, because everything God writes His creation in the rocks, in the animals, in the plant life, in the biosphere. Okay, so the signs of God are everywhere, in us, in creation, and in His book and with His messenger. So we believe this is all one way of reading existence, that everything points to God. Now, what God has told us, He's set humanity, He's given us stewardship of the earth, but that stewardship has a duty of care attached to it. But, you know, I don't think we can just, I think we have to reform ourselves. We have to be in balance with ourselves, that we can live in balance in the world. And until we get rid of materialism and we're focused on a higher journey and a higher power, I don't think, if we're stacking up goods, stacking up material goods, and we're just living for things, we don't get rid of that materialism within us, I don't see how we can live in balance with the world. This is my honestly, I think, you know, and many Muslims around the world are affected by the same materialism. You know, they themselves need to return to their own original message of Islam. You know, so the Prophet's generation and his community lived so simply, They lived so simply. They lived with so little. They lived in respect with nature and the world. And so it's really important to see, you know, to revisit those possibilities and bring them into our own lives.
It's one of the things that I find really encouraging about this movement. I think that we're going through social consciousness, where it's, I think, and this may be a huge generalization, so please forgive me, but I think that the West, and again, I use the term without not knowing exactly what it refers to, is probably quite ahead than the East on this particular aspect of Islam, as in this idea of social consciousness, with regard to the environment. And I'm reminded of in the Middle East where I was studying, and there was a conference that was held, and there were scholars and teachers from all over the world, and it was all in Arabic, so they're all from the Middle East and different regions of the Muslim world. And a lot of the talks that were in this conference were about farming and sustainability. And some of the people attending were asking, we're scholars of religion, what relevance does this have to us? And then the organizers, or the dean of the institute, said, no, this is at the core of our tradition. That it's again, it's a cliched phrase, but it's holistic. And I feel that the West is almost our contribution to remind almost of the wider Muslim world about this effort for social consciousness and our responsibility to the environment. It's just not a question or anything, but it's just my observation. And
I didn't answer Todd's point about BLM and I forgot. I'm sorry. I mean, I hesitate as a white person to say too much about this, but I think that, I used to think that when I was younger, I used to think that I was colorblind and I didn't see race, and having married a Muslim of color, and my wife was originally from Gujarat in Western India, but she grew up here from a young age. I think that it's being truly anti-racist is a real journey, and I think we've all been on a journey in the last few years. Speaking for myself as a white person, I think that I've learned a lot in the last few years, and I had some complacencies in me and maybe some attitudes that I really needed to look at and check. Part of the historical research I've been doing in the last decade has been looking at Malcolm X's trips to Britain in the 1964-65. And he made 4 trips to Britain in that time. And I'm trying to focus on his meetings with Muslims, the mosques he prayed in, the halal restaurants he ate at, the Muslim homes he stayed at, because all this history, unfortunately, the generation who met him, very few of them are still alive. I've interviewed the ones that I can with a partner, Muhammad Ali in Erasol Arabic and in Birmingham. We're interviewing who we can, just to keep those memories of Malcolm X alive, because the stories of Malcolm X that we have are mostly focused on his encounters outside of the Muslim community in Britain. But I can tell you that, having researched it, the majority of time he spent in Britain was with Muslims.
Wow.
Majority of his time. But you wouldn't know that from the history books. So it's so important that we reclaim this history,
It's really fascinating that, as again, once again, it was completely new to me, but I'm very, very interested to see what that results in. And because, I mean, that will attract attention from everywhere. He's so often quoted as like a modern day saint, as of our tradition, and from someone who converted. If I can, Amanda, I believe you had a question. So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself or type your question in the room as you like.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fab.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Brother Yahya, I have a question actually about you've been talking about these early Muslim communities in Liverpool and so on. And obviously I'm living in Cardiff, which we've got the same sort of a history as Liverpool. We have a very old community here, mashallah, since the 1880s, 1890s, that sort of era. And I'm just sort of thinking of how to phrase my question. I did my master's degree in Islam in the UK, and my research focused on religious transmission from converts to their children and the successes and failures therein. And it was, to be totally honest, it was a bit of a grim picture. And one thing that I've noticed in looking at these historical early Muslim convert communities is that what we don't hear about is what their descendants are doing, except in a very few cases where we have a few people who are outspoken about the fact that my great-great-grandfather converted to Islam in Liverpool, et cetera, but these people aren't themselves Muslim. So I just sort of like to know, in your, I was just wondering, have you ever reflected on this? Why is this happening? And how can we as converts sort of maybe do a bit better, as it were, in terms of transmitting the deen to our children? Obviously, it's Allah who guides, but we want to give them the best start that we can. And I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts on this or any contrary observances to what I've seen.
I think that one thing I think that there was, I mean, as I said to Sheikh Bilal earlier, we still don't know the whole story. Okay, so I'm speaking with a lot of hesitation now. So this is a theory that I'm not sure whether it's true or not. Okay, so I suspect that there was a kind of laissez-faire attitude amongst some of the early converts. So along the lines of, well, I chose this faith freely. I can't impose it on my children. So, or it could be that they were the only ones who converted in their family, and their spouse had different ideas, and influenced the children too. There are various explanations. Just generally the kind of general isolation of people, and it was a different time. Even, the Muslim populations that were here weren't particularly practicing either. So that there wasn't, necessarily a lot of support around. I think today it's different. I think that with the population of 3 million Muslims, that there's a lot more opportunity for support. So I feel confident that actually we can do better, and I know several families who are in their second or third generation. It was their grandparents who converted, So it's not all about just people like you and me who converted, and and to be honest, the worries that converts will have for their kids, I think any Muslim in Britain might have for their kids, whether that's a reasonable worry or not, or an unreasonable one. But I don't think the issues are so different, I mean, the way I look at it is, I have 2 kids who are pretty much grown up. The way I look at it is that I have to give them the principles of the faith. I have to give them a conviction that has got nothing to do with my disciplining of them. They have to have their own relationship with God. Because if they associate the religion they were brought up with just with parental respect and discipline and honor or whatever, then they don't have true faith. Their intention must be to please God, not to please their father or their mother. This is what I've tried to instill in my children, and may Allah protect them, may Allah give them that insight. But they have to thrive in spite of or despite me. They have to have their own independent relationship with Allah, and that's it.
Jazakallah khair.
Just a couple of comments that we've had. So Amira is saying, I established a Quilliam choir to revive the tradition. This is going back to an earlier conversation that we had, and it was really well received when we did it. That'd be really interesting to hear about.
Amira Akhtar is asking an important question, that she feels that her family's become more Islamophobic. Do you want to come in on the mic, Amira, and explain a bit more if you want to?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
I just think with the heightened Islamophobia, as it feels like it has become heightened since 9/11, that's reflected, I think, in my family. So I've always tried just to be a good example in, as a person through my character, not to preach to them, because I understand that doesn't really work, but I just feel that they don't say very much, but internally I just feel they really have been blinded, by the negative press. So it's become increasingly difficult, and I've almost like I don't even have conversations with them anymore, but I can just feel it. I can just feel that tension and resentment at times.
Oh,
Which is
Mila,
sad. So I'm thinking maybe I'm just not setting a good enough example, but it's in the, Allah guides who he wants to guide. So I just carry on and pray.
I'll
A
make it
couple of my
easy for
family
you.
took, a couple of my family, my grandmother and my mum did take Shahada with me, but after that, nothing else happened. But I'm happy about that. But yeah,
Well,
I just feel
that's a big thing. I know what you're saying. You'd like to see follow through, but that's something, isn't it? Really.
Yeah, inshallah. Yeah.
Inshallah. I mean, look, it's every family's different. I don't want to make any general remarks, but I just pray for you. May Allah make it easy. I think setting a good example is all you can do, and praying for them, giving sadaqah, Allah opens a way for them, that's all you can do, really. I mean, I think that people, I mean, from my own experience, I think that the fact that I married and I had Muslim children with Muslim names, I think for my whole family, I think that for my whole family, I think that made them see Islam, understand Islam was going to be a central thing in their lives, not just in my life, that kind of extended to, when you say my family, part of their family are Muslim, and the number of Muslims are increasing, if you see what I mean. So, I feel over time, over many years, things can change, things can change. I mean, if I think back to 30 years ago compared to now, there's been a lot of changes, but they seem so incremental that you don't notice them at the time. I mean, I don't know. It's only, I think there are two experiences. One is all the headlines and all the bad news every day and all of that. But then there's also just going through life together as a family. That's also part of their experience. So, inshallah, that will be the predominant one. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Keep the hope.
Inshallah, Allah can guide anybody,
We can,
even the most hostile person.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, I don't give up on the hope, but yeah, inshallah.
Allah make it easy, inshallah. Allah make it easy.
Thanks.
If I can just add something just slightly to that. I mean, you hear stories all the time, don't you, of elderly people and grandparents becoming, taking the shahada and becoming Muslim at the deathbed. So that I think that hope is really so important, isn't it? To just never give up hope, regardless of how distant a person seems outwardly, because you never quite know what's going on inside the person, what they're thinking, and how much of a person of their thoughts, of the thought processes do you really see. And the answer is very little, so you really don't know what's going on. And just as the way that Allah changed your hearts, Allah could change their hearts too. And you've really got to, I guess, as difficult as it is, just always keep that faith and remember that Allah can guide whoever He wants, and He's guided people from much further, And I think there's a beautiful wisdom in having those examples in the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where you would have someone literally on the way to kill and assassinate the Prophet, peace be upon him, becoming beloved, becoming Muslim and embracing the faith, and like I really, I see those examples and I say Alhamdulillah that Allah gave us those examples and allowed those to reach us, because I guarantee, I'm pretty sure at least that whatever animosity and Islamophobia we see, I'm pretty sure if the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, were amongst us, they wouldn't set out on a mission to kill him like some of those who eventually embraced Islam did. So I think those examples, I hope, give us solace, and they're there for a reason. I think they've reached this for a reason.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, so our time's up. I want to thank you. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm really so excited to be to hear about the upcoming projects, and I think there's stuff in there that's really going to be groundbreaking. And I'm really interested in the poetry, so that'll be a nice, a really great addition. So which book is due to be published first?
I think probably the poetry will come second, and the kind of account of the Muslim community, Liverpool community by the Ottoman account, will be first.
Okay, and is that early next year, is it?
Yeah, these both should be out hopefully first half of next year.
Fantastic. Well, it'll be great to have you on talking about it, and hopefully we can talk about our conversation 6 months ago when you were initially mentioned it to us. It would be really good to have you again.
Well, it's been my pleasure to do it if you want to, and I'll see if I can arrange some kind of competition so you can get a free copy or something like that.
Yeah, just okay. So if everyone can tag 3 friends and then share and like the page,
you can figure out some kind of scheme, or
Yeah, we can spin the wheel, or we can do a virtual name out of a hat.
Whatever, yeah, inshallah.
But thank you so much again for coming on and sharing the great work that you're doing, and I hope that's given our listeners a bit of an understanding about, or a realization, I think, that Islam isn't something new in the story of Islam in Britain. That it's actually we're continuing a tradition through conversion, and I think by reviving and reading into the history and researching it, gives us that hope that we're continuing something, not starting from scratch, I hope.
Inshallah.
And thank you everyone for joining. It's been great. Thank you for the comments and the questions, and we'll inshallah be this event was recorded, and we will try and share this as soon as we can. And next month we hope to be joined by Mustafa Davis, who's a film director stroke student of the religion from California. So it'd be really interesting to have him. And it's again, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for your questions, and a big thank you to Yahya once again, and we hope to see you soon, inshallah.
Inshallah. May Allah bless your efforts, everybody, in the New Beginnings project. You have my du'as and my well wishes, and thank you to everybody for tuning in tonight, and keep me and my family in your prayers also, and I will pray for you and yours, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. And we wish you the best in your projects, inshallah, in your research.
May Allah accept what we do, inshallah.
Ameen. Ameen.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And take care, everyone, and stay safe, and we'll see you soon.